What's up everybody, Commander Sanctum here, and today we have a brand new deck tech using Maralen Fae Ascendant. Maralen is a 4/5 Elf Fairy Noble for 2 black-green-blue that has flying. Whenever Maralen or another Elf or Fairy enters, exile 2 cards of an opponent's library. And, once each turn, you can cast a spell with mana value less than or equal to the number of Elves and Fairies you control from among cards exiled with Maralen this turn without paying its mana cost. Maralen is one of those rare cards that can act as a typo commander for more than one creature type. In this case, we have Fairies or Elves to choose from, and since she's Sultai, she's really set up to truly maximize the effectiveness of either type. For this deck tech, we'll be focusing on Fairies, one of my personal favorite creature types out there. A lot of Fairies benefit from having Flash, making it much easier to get some cards that we can cast on our opponent's turn, maximizing Maralen's abilities to their full potential. With that, let's get into the card highlights. Starting out with our Fairy selection, we have a few legendary ones that also have Flash. Flash will be super important for this deck, since in order to actually get cards from Maralen to cast on an opponent's turn, we need a Fairy to enter on that player's turn. Widen the Biting Gale, Obira Dreaming Duelist, and Nimrus Una's Trickster all have Flash to help us achieve this, while giving us some other useful abilities as well. Widen lets you return and recast it as many times as you need, albeit for a somewhat steep cost of 6 mana. Obira X is a great way to get some extra damage onto your opponents, since we'll be playing a lot of Fairies anyways, and Nimrus is a great card to supplement us casting spells on our opponent's turns by giving us some extra card advantage from doing so. For some non-legendary Flash Fairies, we have Fairy Mastermind, which is an absolutely phenomenal source of extra card advantage for us, and Fairy Harbinger, which lets us get our best Fairy to the top of our library when it enters. There's also High Fae Trickster, which will likely be the best Fairy we have to synergize with Maralen, since she'll give all of our other spells we cast Flash. This means that we'll be able to play even our non-Flash Fairies on our opponent's turns, letting us really maximize the number of Maralen triggers we can get. Every typal deck needs its lords, and Fairies are no exception. Thankfully, we have access to quite a few good ones. Scion of Una is yet another Fairy that has Flash, but also gives all our other Fairies +1/+1 in Shroud, giving a slight power boost alongside a powerful targeted removal protection. Tegwil Duke of Splendor instead lets us draw a card whenever one of our Fairies dies, giving us some nice card advantage as a silver lining to our creatures being killed. Fairy Noble is kind of a pseudo-lord, since you need to do some extra work to get the full Anthem effect, but is still a great option for the deck, especially at a low 3 mana cost. Glenalendra Liege is effectively a Fairy Lord as well, since most Fairies are going to be either blue, black, or both, making it a great way to really boost up your army. Since we care about Fairies entering for Maralen's ability, Archmage of Echoes is a great way to maximize on this, since each Fairy we cast will be copied. Even when casting a legendary Fairy, though the token will die immediately due to the legendary rule, it still counts as a Fairy entering the battlefield, triggering Maralen's effect 2 times like any non-legendary creature would. Shadow Puppeteers makes 2 Fairy Rogues when it enters, giving us a total of 3 Maralen triggers when playing this Fairy. Not only that, but it takes any of our smaller Fairies and turns them into 4/4 dragons when attacking, making it a great way to close out a game with combat damage. Blightwing Bandit is similar to Nimrus from before, letting us get some sort of effect whenever we cast a spell on an opponent's turn. In this case, the Bandit gives us a pseudo-Maralen effect, stealing the top card of an opponent's library and letting us cast it for the rest of the game, albeit for actual mana unlike Maralen. Malleable Imposter is another one that has Flash, but also enters the battlefield as one of your opponent's best creatures, while maintaining its Fairy Shapeshifter creature type, and thus still triggering Maralen even if copied into a non-Fairy creature. Halo Forager will let you recast any instant or sorcery spell in a graveyard that you want, as long as you have the mana to pay for it, letting you use your opponent's spells against them, or perhaps reusing our own ramp or card draw spells. Spellstutter Sprite is pretty much the quintessential Fairy-based counterspell effect, since you can cast it for a simple 2 mana and have it counter pretty much anything, so long as you have a decently sized Fairy army to back it up. Cloud of Fairies also costs 2 mana and essentially replaces itself when cast, since it lets you untap 2 lands when it enters. Needless to say, this makes for a great target for any sort of flicker effects, since it could potentially make you net positive in terms of mana when targeted. Fairy Bladecrafter is an absolute game ender in a Fairy typal deck, so long as you can keep it out and consistently hit your opponents with your Fairies. If you can do this, then when the Bladecrafter itself dies, it can be an explosion of such magnitude that can easily end the game on the spot. Since our main goal is to really maximize the number of Fairies we have enter to get as large of a card pool as we can with Maralen, there's no real better way to do so than to use token generators. While Fairies don't have the most token generators in the world, we still have access to quite a few good ones. Bitter Blossom and Bitter Bloom Bearer both do the same thing. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life and create a fairy token. These are excellent ways to generate a fairy token a turn for effectively free. Plus, the Bearer has the upside of also being a fairy creature with flash, letting us use it on an opponent's turn to get some cards from Maralen. Fairy Formation is a fairy creature that lets you create more fairy tokens and draw cards as well, all for a somewhat sizable cost of 4 mana. Seriously though, if you have nothing else to cast or want to get a fairy token out on an opponent's turn, this will be a great way to do so. Alila Cunning Conqueror can be a great way to get some fairy tokens on our opponent's turns, so long as we have spells to play on that specific turn. Honestly, with the amount of flash fairies we have, we'll likely be able to get to trigger it rather consistently, giving us an extra 2 cards from an opponent's library each time thanks to the additional token created. Una, Queen of the Fae, is another great way to get a bunch of Maralen triggers on an opponent's turn, since you can activate her ability whenever. Target this against someone playing a single color deck, and you'll be able to generate a huge amount of token advantage for not that much mana. Fae Bloom Trick gives us a nice ratio of 2 tokens for 3 mana, while simultaneously tapping down an opponent's creature, making it a great pre-attack spell to cast and take your opponent's biggest creature out of combat. Since we're going to be rather dependent on both Maralen and having a large fairy army to truly take advantage of her abilities, we'll want to make sure we have adequate protection for both throughout the game. Lightning Greaves is pretty much always going to be the best way to protect Maralen herself from removal, at least specifically targeted removal, which could take up a large chunk of players' options. Heroic Intervention is a way to protect your entire army from a destruction-based board wipe, making it a great response to something like a Blasphemous Act or Supreme Verdict. Finally, in those cases where nothing else will work, such as against something like a Farewell, we have Spell Stutter, a fairy-based counterspell that pretty much acts as a normal counterspell so long as we have at least a few fairies out on the battlefield. Since we're a creature-type heavy deck, there's a few good card draw options I wanted to specifically call out. Harmonized Crescendo and Distant Melody are effectively the same thing, letting you draw cards equal to the number of creatures of a chosen type that you control. The Crescendo is probably the better of the two, since it both has Convoke to help whittle away the large mana cost of 6, while also being instant, letting you take advantage of it against something like an opponent's board wipe if need be. Keep Watch, on the other hand, draws you a card for each attacking creature. While this can be good for us since we're likely to have a somewhat decently sized army of flyers, it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be your attacking creatures. If your opponent ends up attacking with, say, a large token army, you can cast this to draw a card for each of those creatures instead, making it a great situational card draw effect. Since we have access to green, we have a number of good options for ramp effects to help us have enough mana to actually cast our fairies and spells on each turn. Maraleaf Pixie is a great mana dork for us, since it's both a fairy and can add either blue or green mana for us, with blue being one of the more primary colors of the deck thanks to all the fairy cards. Growth Spiral and Urban Evolution are 2 flavors of the same effect, and some of my personal favorite ramp cards in Simic, since they not only let you play an additional land, but also let you draw some cards to boot. Finally, there are a number of good utility cards we have access to that work well with our overall themes. As mentioned before, we care mostly about fairies entering the battlefield, and what better way to achieve this than to flicker ones out we already have. For that, we have Ghostly Flicker, which will let us flicker out 2 creatures. Not only can this re-trigger Maralen and any ETBs on the creatures themselves, but it also acts as a great protection effect against targeted removal, since it'll make any spell cast against your creatures fizzle if they flicker out in response. Fairy Tauntings fits with our sub-theme of casting spells on your opponent's turn, and even triggers Maralen's ability as well. Since Maralen doesn't specify a fairy creature, and since the Tauntings is a fairy tribal enchantment, that means that when it enters, it counts as a fairy entering, and thus will trigger Maralen's effect. Wilderness Reclamation is a great way to help make sure we can cast spells on our opponent's turns to trigger Maralen's effect, since having access to mana is going to be one of the most difficult aspects of actually being able to do so. The dual biddings, Patriarchs and Bloodline, both let us get all of our fairies back out of our graveyard in case they're all destroyed. Obviously great spells to cast after a board wipe. The best part is that even if Maralen herself is one of the cards being returned, she'll see all the other fairies entering as well, giving you a mass card pool to choose from for her ability. I'm very much in the camp of, it's not a Sultai deck if it doesn't have Villainous Wealth in it, and this one is no exception. The best part about VW in this deck, however, is the fact that it actually lines up with our commander thematically very well, since it's all about casting our opponent's cards, exactly what we'll be doing with Maralen. Here's an example deck list utilizing all the previously mentioned cards. Additional cards include more fairies in Likeness Looter and Fairy Seer, further fairy token generators in Stolen by the Fae and Notorious Throng, and some other great card draw choices in Pact of the Serpent and Kindred Discovery. I love that Maralen can act as a typo commander for multiple different creature types. Being able to head an elf or fairy deck makes her very modular in design, and really expands the capabilities of decks that she can be used in. That being said, I do think that focusing on one type over mixing them both is really the way to go. There are so many elf or fairy cards that care about having other elves or fairies that mixing both creature types in a single deck really reduces the effectiveness of these types of cards. Personally, I also think that Fairies is going to be slightly better than Elves in terms of Maralen's ability. Since Maralen cares about how many Elves or Fairies entered in that turn, using Fairies, many of which have Flash, lets you really capitalize on getting the trigger every turn, including your opponents. While Elves do have some Flash support, it's nowhere near as much as Fairies, giving Fairies the slight advantage in my opinion. Either way though, a deck can really be made with either creature type and have it work out wonderfully, so if Elves or Fairies is something you're interested in, give Maralen a try. I hope you enjoyed watching this deck tech on Maralen Fae Ascendant. The full deck list outlined in this video can be found at the Architect link at the top of the description. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to drop a like and comment, as well as subscribe to the channel for more Magic content. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.